Good morning and welcome to this special ITV news programme with the latest on the war in Ukraine. We're with you until 9:30, bringing you the latest from our correspondents from around the world. Let's start with the main developments we're waking up to this morning. Dozens of Ukrainian soldiers dead following yesterday's Russian bomb attack on a military barrack.
Я хочу, щоб мене зараз почули всі.
As the Russian onslaught destroys his country, President Zelensky makes a fresh plea for peace. The hard road for diplomacy as Russia seeks help from Beijing. President Biden warns the Chinese president that there will be consequences if China decides to help Putin militarily. And in Moscow, Vladimir Putin appears in an extraordinary pro-war rally as his forces continue their bombardment of Ukraine. And we'll be live in Poland, a country buckling under the strain of refugees coming into the country. Good morning and thank you for joining us on this special extended ITV news programme as we bring you the latest developments on Russia's invasion on war in Ukraine. It's believed at least 40 Ukrainian soldiers have died after their barracks were targeted in a Russian airstrike. It happened yesterday in Mykolaiv, a strategically important city on the Black Sea in the south of the country. This is the scene right now in the capital, Kyiv, as Ukraine wakes up to day 24 of the invasion. And as both sides see increasing losses, President Zelensky appealed to Moscow overnight, saying now is the time to talk. Hannah Miller has the latest.
A child is pulled from the rubble after a Russian attack on an army barracks in the strategic southern city of Mykolaiv. ITV News has not been able to verify these videos, but it's thought at least 30 people have died after 3 cruise missiles hit the base. It happened at such close range, said the city's mayor. There was no time for air raid sirens to get people to safety.
Я хочу, щоб мене зараз почули всі.
In the early hours of this morning, Ukraine's President Zelensky once again issued a rallying cry from the streets, calling for talks and claiming that without peace, Russia will not be able to rise again for several generations. But this doesn't look like a country that's struggling to come together. President Putin, surrounded by an apparently adoring crowd, bust into a Moscow football stadium yesterday to hear him claim that Russia has not known unity like this for a long time.
Такого единения у нас давно не было.
But do they know that this is being done in their name? A video released by pro-Russian Chechen fighters shows black smoke billowing out of the windows of a tower block in the besieged city of Mariupol. Satellite images show the utter devastation in a city where Ukrainian authorities say 90% of buildings have been damaged or destroyed, scenes described by the Red Cross as apocalyptic. In previously residential areas like this village north of Kyiv, these are the only remnants of life as it was just 3 weeks ago. With homes razed to the ground, basic necessities are becoming harder to find, with a warning this morning that food supply chains across the country are now breaking down. Hannah Miller, ITV News.
Well, let's get the latest from our global security editor, Rohit Kachru, who is in Kyiv for us this morning. Rohit, day 24 of this war and invasion. Where are we in Kyiv?
Well, look, I mean, every day of this conflict feels like a potential crossroads, and this is the 24th day of this conflict. I think what's different today is the scale of the bloodshed on the Ukrainian side overnight and the tone of the language as well. In terms of the bloodshed, that huge strike at a military base, which Hannah Miller was reporting on, we're still seeing images coming out there of rescues, of children being rescued as well. And in terms of the tone of the language, well, that comes on 2 fronts, really. Firstly, from President Zelensky, whose message today is that the time has come for peace talks, but also the language we were hearing both from Washington and from Beijing overnight following that a really important call between the presidents of the United States and of China. The Chinese president, a crucial ally of the Russians. The assessment of some Western intelligence agencies is that actually the Chinese, though they want to be supportive of their Russian allies, are still trying to work out precisely what that position is, how much they want to support them. Do they want to do so militarily or economically? They have certainly already put on record the fact that they respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which offers the Americans and some of the allies some hope in terms of the Chinese position in this, which may well prove to be incredibly consequential over the coming days and weeks. But the feeling is, on the NATO side of this, that although the Russians have been slowed down and significantly lost momentum, particularly over the last 10 days or so, and particularly on the outskirts of this city, Kyiv, where, you know, we've seen new satellite images showing that some of the Russian military have dug in, that they've created trenches close to their equipment and the outskirts of the city. Nevertheless, the feeling is, among the Americans and some of the allies, that Putin's end goal, his ambitions have not changed. It's simply the timing that's changed. And so what does that mean in the coming days? Well, it means perhaps that given there is a finite number of precision weapons available to the Russians, that they are more likely to start using increasing numbers of so-called dumb bombs, launching indiscriminate attacks, the sort of attacks we've seen so tragically in places like Mariupol this weekend, and also here in the city of Kyiv.
Rohit, that's a great explanation of the bigger picture. Can I just ask you, just what is Kyiv like? What's it like to move around? Are you meeting people? We hear reports that it is a city emptied of its people. 3 million Ukrainians have left the country. What's it like in Kyiv, just going around the place?
Well, you know, we've tried to show you on the street level over the last few weeks. It is quiet. I think what's different this morning compared to previous mornings, and this is the 24th morning of this conflict, is, you know, out here from our position, we can smell burning. You know, you probably can't see it across the skyline, but, you know, we've seen these clouds of smoke which appear to be getting closer to us. And we can certainly smell what's going on. You know, to answer your question, on the streets, it's quiet. The curfew ended not very long ago, perhaps an hour ago. People are trying to go about their business, but these are, you know, we're right in the heart of the city, and this sense of anticipation is now into its fourth week. You know, we know, and everyone in the city knows that that Russian military presence is only a few miles away. They know too that the Russians have struggled to take towns like Irpin and Hostomel, which are just a few miles from here, small commuter towns the size of Canterbury, which the Russians have so far struggled to take. You know, that gives the Ukrainian people some amount of hope, the fact that this has been so difficult for the Russians, but also it continues to create fear because this is so close. So the city's quiet. More than half of the population of this city has left. They've gone to other parts of the country, primarily to Lviv in the west. Many people have gone over the border. They've gone to Poland to see relatives elsewhere in countries like Germany. We hear that quite often. But, you know, what's new this week is that almost every day people have woken up to news of a residential block being hit in some sort of shelling attack, you know, of civilian casualties. You know, that's new in the last few days for people in Kyiv. And we're hearing about those sorts of attacks almost every day now.
Rohit, thank you very much indeed, and we'll be in Lviv and Poland and back to you in the rest of the programme. But we can go now to Lesia Vasilenko, who's a Ukrainian MP and was in the UK this week and met Prime Minister Boris Johnson. She's on her way back to Kyiv, where Rohit was speaking to us from, and she joins me now from Prague. Lesia, thank you so much for joining us. What are your thoughts in terms of going back, and what Prime Minister Boris Johnson told you about what the UK can do to help Ukraine?
Well, first of all, good morning. And I'm so jealous of Rick, who was just standing there in Kyiv, my native city. I hope to be back there within the next 24 hours. And look forward to saying hello to that city. Although it's bombed, it still remains beautiful. The smoke that you were seeing in the city, I just want to comment on that really briefly. It's coming from the explosions, and the problem was Kyiv is that it's located in such a way that it's just going to keep being there. Like the sky is going to keep grey for a couple of days because of the geography. It looks as if it's like on hills, but really whenever fog or something, it just stays there for days and for days, and it causes a lot of problems with the air quality for the people who remain. So that's another issue that actually Kyivites are looking on. And the minute I saw the skyline being so grey, I immediately could imagine what the air is like actually in the city right now. And nevertheless, I miss it every second. So looking forward to that. As to what is going on the international scene, we see President Zelensky calling for the peace talks, and he is doing that quite rightly. He will now be talking from a position of strength, including for the fact that the UK and the UK have actually given Ukraine quite a lot of weapons, of assault weapons, including Starstreak missile launchers, which can operate at night. Having those kind of weapons gives us a kind of predominance on the battlefield, and I think that now we can have a whole different kind of peace talks, which will be in the interest of the Ukrainian people, and President Zelensky can hold those talks from a position of strength and of confidence. So this is the reason why we're seeing that, and this has been confirmed by the Prime Minister and also by the Ministry of Defence in the UK.
What more, but on the point, Leslie, what more can the United Kingdom and other European countries do in order to aid Ukraine, either militarily or diplomatically? You referenced the sort of peace talks, if they can be described as that. What more would you want to see from the UK?
Well, again, this war is a marathon, so it will be going on for years, maybe months if we are lucky. The reason being because Putin has a goal to destroy Ukraine and erase it, crush it from the face of the earth, and we must all be aware of that. If Ukraine is to keep fighting on its own and within its own territory, then we must keep getting these weapons. It cannot be a one-time offer. It has to be a process. Our men need to be trained, possibly alongside some special units. We need to have our partner armies appearing next to us, but that time will show. At the moment, we need to keep the weapons coming, and we need to keep the ammunition coming, the humanitarian aid coming as soon as possible. I've seen in the reports you were just publishing that the Red Cross is appalled at what has become of Mariupol, where 90% of the buildings are damaged. I'm sorry, the Red Cross is not even on the ground. They need to get down there. Their missions need to be working in towns like Mariupol, like Volnovakha, like Irpin, like Bucha, providing the assistance. These organizations were created to provide. The same goes for UNHCR. So it's crucial that the British government puts a pressure on these organizations to be present on the ground. And if they are unable to do so because they are still hoping to get an okay from Putin to do their mission, then it's up to the UK and other countries, along with Ukraine and Ukrainian forces, to create such humanitarian missions that would ensure safe passage for the people.
Lesia,
and of course,
just one last question. Sorry, Lesia, sorry to interrupt you. Just how does it feel personally to be going back to Kyiv. How will you get there? What are your relatives and friends feeling and telling you?
You know, it feels great. I have been out of the country for a little over a week, and there's a sense of detachment. There's a sense of loss of home. So I really want to go back just to sort of feel the soil under my feet and feel the air. It's just home. You know, home, whatever it is, it's always the best that you can get. And to go back, yes, it's tricky. Yes, the road is taking a huge amount of time, more than I could ever anticipate it would. But at the end of the day, I just want to be there. As for my family, my friends, well, some think that it's madness to be going back. Like my strongest asset personally to fight for my country is actually the knowledge of foreign languages and the availability of a large network of contacts across the globe. And I'm getting told, like, just stay somewhere safe and just keep doing what you're doing. It doesn't matter if you're in Ukraine or not. It just matters that you're alive and not under missile shots. But to tell you the truth, I cannot communicate properly if I'm not there on the ground and if I don't have a feeling of the situation. And with all my heart, I want to be there with the people of Ukraine, fighting alongside with them and doing what I can.
Lesia Vasilenko, thank you so much for joining us, and safe travels on your way back to Kyiv. Throughout this morning, I will be joined by my esteemed colleague, Bill Neely, to guide us through the intricacies of what's happening on the ground and diplomatically. But first, we can go to Michael Clark, who is from the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI as it's better known. Michael, thank you so much for joining us at this early hour for this special programme. You have got an extraordinarily long career in military analysis and diplomatic analysis. Where do you think we are going into week 4 of this conflict? And if you were Vladimir Putin, how does the world look to you?
Well, I mean, one of the dangerous things about this conflict is that we all think that Putin is losing. He probably thinks he's winning because he has, I think, very large objectives. I think where we are in terms of the war is that we've gone through, let's say, the first 2 stages, and the Ukrainians have fought the Russians to a standstill for now. The Russians are trying to advance along 3 main axes, 3 main lines of advance. They haven't got enough troops or the competence to do it across all 3, so they've run out of troops effectively to achieve their objectives. But we're about to engage on stage 3, which is where the Russians reinforce. They're bringing troops in from the Far East. They're bringing troops even in from the Pacific Fleet, presumably they're Marines. They're bringing troops from Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, where they've been holding down their own frozen conflict there. It would be interesting to see if something else happens in South Ossetia and Georgia once the Russians leave. So they're actually mustering troops, plus some of the mercenaries they're bringing in from Syria and Africa, because they intend to reinforce. So Putin is going to double down. And what is probably going to happen is that the story of Mariupol, which looks as if it may, the agony may finally be over soon, if it is about to be conquered, and then a different sort of agony begins. That might happen in Kharkiv, we'll see. But you would expect 1 or 2 of the cities to be captured by the Russians, and the others will be bombarded. And then the big military move is that the Russians look as if they are trying to unite some of their forces in the north and some of their forces in the south, particularly the 1st Guards Tank Army and the 6th Combined Arms Army in the north, with the 58th and the 8th Combined Arms Armies in the south, to actually get them to push together somewhere north or south of Poltava, we would guess. And they're trying to encircle Ukrainian forces. And the Ukrainians, therefore, might have to decide either to fight the encirclement, which would be very difficult for smaller outnumbered forces, or to escape to the west to live to fight another day. And to do that, they would have to give up resistance in the east. So if the Russians manage this encirclement, and it's a long slog for them, it won't be easy, but that might be the focus for the next week or 10 days, perhaps. The Ukrainians may then find that they have a very unpalatable decision to make as to whether to go west and live to fight another day, particularly perhaps in the defense of Kyiv, or whether to try and fight it out and keep defending all of those cities along the Ukrainian border in the east.
Michael, stay with us, but I want to go to Bill next. Bill, I mean, 24 days ago, Vladimir Putin thought that Ukraine would just fold within a matter of hours or days. What Michael's been explaining there is an extraordinary picture of the calculus that the Russian military has to face. Are you surprised with your experience that we're here?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I will defer to Michael, who's the military expert, but it seems to me that if the American figures are correct and Russia has lost 7,000 troops, and as you'll know, Raggy, you multiply that by 3 to 4 for the numbers of injured. So let's round it up at 20,000. That's 10% of Russia's invading army dead or injured in 3 weeks. That seems to me an extraordinary figure, and I'd love to know when I finish what Michael thinks and putting that in some kind of perspective. If you're winning, or your plan, as Putin says, it's going to plan, if that's true, bringing 16,000 troops from Syria doesn't look like the mark of someone who's winning, or troops from the Wagner mercenaries from Africa, or troops from the Central African Republic, from Tropical. I mean, this seems quite extraordinary. Also, you know, yesterday's rally, I mean, was that a sign of weakness or of strength? Why did he have to have that rally? I actually wonder whether that rally was pre-planned 2 or 3 weeks ago as a kind of victory rally. And remember, I mean, I was in Crimea in 2014 when we saw those little green men on the streets, no insignia, Russian troops. Crimea was taken without a shot. I think in his own mind, possibly Vladimir Putin thought
it was going to be a rerun of that.
We did that. We'll just waltz in. I mean, remember also how British and American troops thought they would be greeted in Iraq with roses. Well, maybe some of them were in the first few days, but it didn't turn out like that. So, you know, these seem to be extraordinary. I think Plan A has gone, possibly Plan B has gone, but I'd love to hear Michael's view on.
Let's go back to him. Michael, I mean, you must be stunned at where we are on day 24 of this war, given that, you know, Vladimir Putin thought that, you know, Ukraine war would be over within a matter of hours or days. Are you surprised, having analysed, you know, Russia's military might under Putin for so long, that he's in a hard slog, to put it mildly?
I think we all are surprised, Raggy. We all expected the Russians to be able to do what their forces, at least on paper, should have been able to do. They've made just about every tactical error in the book you could possibly make. So not having armor and infantry work together, the reason that the Ukrainians have been able to set up so many ambushes against their armor is because they didn't have their infantry going forward ahead of them in mechanized infantry to clear out all of the possible ambushes before the armor came through. They've not integrated their air and ground very well. They've just not behaved very well because they're completely unready for battle. These troops may have been exercised, but they were not battle ready, and it shows all the time. And remember, these troops were all told, right up to quite high levels of command, only 24 hours before that they were going to actually invade another country. They all thought, the way Putin had been saying to the rest of the world, that they were on exercises. So they weren't ready for any of this. And incidentally, I think Bill is exactly right. When you think about numbers of dead, and the number of 7,000 is probably the conservative number. So it's let's say it's at least 7,000, probably a bit higher. But you've got to multiply that number. So the number of casualties with dead and injured, and sometimes the injured have a bigger psychological effect on the home population, sometimes than the dead even. But the number of casualties will be somewhere up in the 20,000s at the moment. And remember that in Afghanistan, the Russians suffered 15,000 dead, and let's guess around about a total of, say, 40,000 casualties in total across 10 years. So the Russians are halfway to their Afghanistan totals after 3 weeks, as opposed to 10 years. And that will keep on going because the Ukrainians are not going to roll over. And in a funny sort of way, although the Ukrainian army is very outnumbered, when they crack as formed units, which inevitably they probably will, they won't just disappear. That those formed units will then break up into smaller groups, and they'll blend into the territorial defense forces. There are 25 brigades, one brigade for every region. Some of them are very amateur, but some of them are not. A lot of them have had experience in the Donbass over the years. So as and when the Ukrainian army breaks, if it does, it'll blend back into the territorial defense forces, and they'll carry on in a different sort of way. So in a funny sort of sense, a country of 45 million is going to outnumber the Russians in terms of armed people who are prepared to fight and are really quite experienced.
Michael, thank you very much indeed for that analysis, and it's quite sobering. Thank you very much indeed. Let's get more on what is going on inside Russia itself, and for more of that, we can talk to a former English teacher and blogger who's recently returned to the UK. Joshua Levy worked at the Sakhalin State University in the Russian Far East. Joshua, your time was cut short almost as soon as the invasion began, but can you just tell us, we're all intrigued to find out what is going on inside Russia amongst the populace. Michael and Bill were talking about, the dead and the wounded, and when that news penetrates, the Russian, populace, what's going on in Russia from your time there?
Well, actually, the thing is, most people, they do understand what's actually happening. I mean, most of the news media, what you get outside, is that it's all, bad news, and people don't really care about what's happening. This is really not true. People are highly intelligent. I think the life on the street is very different to what's being said online. In terms of my experience, I would say that most people can't really express what they want to say. They don't want to have this particular problem between Russia and Ukraine. I think most of the Russian people have got some of their family members in Ukraine. So I think, as I said many times before, some of them are highly ashamed, and some of them really don't want to actually believe that this is happening. And most of them are very open-minded people. Like most of the Russians who I know, I've been living there for almost 8 years now. They're very, very nice people, and they just can't express it because obviously, if you were to say something online, or if you go out on the street and if you say something, then you will have a huge big problem there.
Joshua, you've spoken about the fear of people wanting to speak out, but is the news of the reality of what's happening in Ukraine really penetrating through the fog of, the propaganda that we see in Russia, as you describe?
Well, we have two types of people. We have the younger generation, which is between 18 and almost 30, 37, 8 years old, and then we have the older generation, and there is a huge big divide between the two. So the younger generation knows how to actually get the news, so they can use any of the VPNs available, and they can see what's happening both inside and outside Russia. But the older generation don't have this experience of how to use VPN and how to use other sorts of things to actually check on the news. So their main source of news is basically what's being shown on TV. So this is where the problem comes. So the people who are young and people who are who know how to access things outside Russia, they understand what's happening, but they can't express it, because as we know that if you were to say something online or offline in any shape or form, you would have a huge problem. And this also applies to me too. So, but the older generations don't want to believe that there is a problem between Russia and Ukraine. They think this is absolutely fake. If you try to show them something, if you try to show them some other picture or from another viewpoint, they just think that this is absolutely fake and I'm being extremely stupid.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you very much indeed for that insight. Very briefly, Bill, all eyes are on what's going to happen within Russia, but we don't really know, despite, Joshua gave us an insight. But
well, I mean, I think one of the most alarming things, Joshua talked about the fear, is I was reading that some people who've spoken out against the war are finding graffiti daubed on the doors of their flats, of their apartments or houses, the Z. I mean, it looks like Putin, in his speech, for example, the other evening, which was angry, talking about scum and traitors, it's almost as if the totalitarianism is creeping in behind his already authoritarian rule. And I think, that's a real danger for everyone who speaks out against the war now.
Thank you very much indeed, Bill. Well, it is just 7:30 exactly, and a quick look at the latest developments on the Ukraine conflict. It's thought that at least 40 Ukrainian soldiers have died after a Russian bomb attack on a military barracks in Mykolaiv in the south of the country yesterday. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for fresh peace talks overnight to avoid more loss of life. And President Biden has warned the Chinese president that there will be consequences if China decides to help Putin militarily. And as we're hearing from Bill, in Moscow, Vladimir Putin appeared in an extraordinary pro-war rally as his forces continue their bombardment of Ukraine. Well, more on the talks between President Biden and the Chinese president. Xi and Debbie Edward, our Asia correspondent, is in Beijing. Debbie, what's your analysis of what was discussed, and what do you think President Biden's mention of consequences for China if they help Putin militarily will mean in Beijing?
Good morning, Rai. Well, I think there's one thing that both sides always agree on between China and the United States, and that is that their relationship will define the 21st century for better or for worse. So that is why it is good for all of us that those two presidents were continuing to talk last night, almost a 2-hour conversation. And what was very interesting following that call is that it was the Chinese that were first to produce a statement. Usually we are kept waiting for hours or even till the next day to hear from China with detail of what was discussed, but instead very, very quickly we heard some detail that primarily, of course, it was Ukraine, but also Taiwan that was discussed. That contrasted quite a lot with what we heard from the US. We had to wait quite a few hours to hear from them, and it was quite a toned down version of events compared to the strong language that we had heard from the US leading up to that call, those severe warnings that China would face big consequences if it is to support Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it seems that from Xi to Biden there was this stern warning that threats just won't work when dealing with negotiations with China. I think although there wasn't anything really concrete to come out of that 2-hour discussion, both sides did agree that it was candid and it was constructive. And I think part of that is due to there is a relationship between President Biden and President Xi that dates back long before both men were in power. And I think there is an understanding there. They know how to deal with one another, and that's why that both sides did agree that at this time, perhaps more than ever, they need to manage their differences. But following that conversation this morning, there was an editorial in one of the state newspapers, perhaps following up on some of those threats from the United States that there would be severe consequences if China does get involved in Russia's invasion. And China again restated that its relationship with Russia is rock solid. It described it as its most important and stable diplomatic alliance. So what we're waiting for now, Raggy, is to see some sort of action. China says it's going to play this constructive role in peace, but how exactly is that going to play out? On Thursday, we did see a meeting between Chinese foreign officials and the Russian ambassador here in Beijing, so it clearly is keeping these kind of channels open.
Debbie, stay with us, but I want to go to Bill. Bill, as Debbie was saying, nothing concrete from this chat between Biden and Xi, but symbolic nonetheless.
Yes, symbolic, and it is good that they're talking, and both leaders face a critical choice. For China, this is a critical moment. It has said it has a no-limits partnership with Russia. Well, the test of that is right now. What exactly does that mean? China, at the core of its national principles, has always been territorial integrity. Is it really going to throw that out the window and allow Russia just to get away with this invasion? Has President Xi backed the wrong horse.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a testing time for him, and of course for President Biden himself. I just wanted to ask Debbie, because I find it curious. Debbie, as a former Washington correspondent, I know exactly what you mean about, the deluge of information that you sometimes get from the White House after something like this, and we simply didn't. Most of the information seemed to be coming from Beijing, and yet I thought it went two ways. They didn't call it a war or an invasion, which you might think is perhaps pessimistic, and yet they said US and China must shoulder our share of international responsibilities, which sounds to me rather hopeful. I wonder, which do you see? Is the glass half full or half empty?
Well, I think China has struggled to see how it's going to play this from the beginning. I think, like you mentioned earlier, it was also caught out by how long this is taking. So it wants to back China. Russia, it does have a pro-Russia stance, but it's wondering to how much it goes into that camp. And with regards to United States, of course, we do talk about the good relationship between Russia and China as in terms of the economic trading partners, but that is dwarfed by the economic relationship that, of course, China has with the United States and Europe. So it is trying to play everyone off and make sure that it comes out with its economic interests intact. But I think it is important for me, Bill, that there is that relationship between Biden and Xi. There is that good guanxi, if you will, between those two men. And I think that's why perhaps we did see that toned down version of events from the United States.
Debbie, thank you very much indeed. Debbie Edward in Beijing. And we can go to our correspondent, Giles Gibson, in the Latvian capital, Riga. Giles, let's start with that rally that we've talked about yesterday in Moscow, where President Putin addressed a pro-war stadium of people. Allegedly, many of them bussed in. What did you make of that?
Yeah, some of the people who were at this rally at this football stadium in Moscow said that they were state employees and that they had been bussed in, effectively saying that they had been pressured to attend this event. Throughout this crisis, we've been seeing Vladimir Putin, popping up on state TV behind his desk or at that long table when he's meeting with world leaders at the Kremlin. But this was Vladimir Putin up on stage, not wearing a suit, in front of a large crowd. It was certainly a very carefully stage-managed event, except for the point when state TV in Russia cut away from his speech briefly, the Kremlin blaming that on a technical glitch. When they did get back to Vladimir Putin, we saw him claiming really that the Russian people are united behind what he called this special military operation. But clearly, as we have been hearing from independent monitoring groups inside Russia, thousands of people, not just in Moscow, but in cities all over the country, have been detained by the Russian police in recent weeks for protesting or just trying to protest against this invasion launched by their president.
Giles, I mean, the narrative was quite clear, though, wasn't it, in this speech and this sort of rally? It was, the war, he didn't call it a war, as you said, but this military operation continues. There was no sense in which he was going to back down at all, which is what Michael Clark was telling us earlier, that Vladimir Putin is just going to continue to double down.
Yeah, we saw in this speech Vladimir Putin saying that Russia is going to accomplish all of its goals, claiming that the Russian people are fully behind him. Clearly, we have had different justifications from the Kremlin as to why they've launched this special military operation, as they keep describing it. They've said this about the denazification of Ukraine somehow, without really providing any evidence as to why that needs to happen, or any evidence as to how the government in Kyiv is somehow Nazified. They've also talked about how they need to go into areas of eastern Ukraine. Russian-speaking people are somehow subject to some sort of a genocide in there, again, providing absolutely no evidence for that. And the Ukrainian government have been pushing back against all of those claims. Clearly, negotiations have been continuing via a video link, but no major breakthroughs as of yet.
Okay, Giles, in Riga, I should say, thank you very much indeed. Well, there has been little light in these dark times which have descended over Ukraine, and for few, they are savouring every moment with loved ones who have managed to seek sanctuary abroad. Rosti, a doctor from Bristol, has been reunited with his sister and nieces. They met in Poland and then travelled to Ireland. Our correspondent Rupert Evelyn on one family reunion.
After weeks filled with fears and anxiety, the simplest of moments have added weight. Bristol doctor Rosti is presented with a picture drawn by his niece. She has fled from Ukraine. The image shows her with her mum and uncle, a family finally together. They were all reunited in Poland at the beginning of this week. To understand what that meant was, Rosti told me, to understand love.
I was a bit emotional myself. It's just finally I just realized how much I love them, how much I miss them. You never appreciate that when their lives are not in danger, and when everything goes as smoothly, and when there is stability. When there is some risk or instability, you quite understand what they mean for you.
His sister and nieces fled Ukraine with a family friend and her children. Because Britain's resettlement programme is not quite ready to receive them all, they headed to Ireland, a journey that included officials waving them through despite some expired passports.
It was probably the most stressful 2 minutes of my life. And on his way back, I saw a massive smile on his face. So he was really hoping to get us through, and he was given that green light by his supervisor, and we boarded.
For all those Ukrainians who fled, there are many more left behind.
My parents still, very keen to stay in Ukraine, and I offered them to bring them over almost every day, and they say no, we'll stay.
You'll still ask?
I still ask. I hope they change their mind one day. There's a lot of uncertainty. I think my sister and her family and Irina and her family probably don't realize them. Maybe they do, but maybe don't fully appreciate that there's a possibility they'll never see their husbands again, and they may never go back to Ukraine.
For now, though, they are safe, warm and welcome in Ireland. In these insecure times, they have security and are able to move freely without fear of attack. Rupert Evelyn, ITV News.
One story of a family reunion in Ireland. One of the most surprising and shocking impacts of this crisis has been the sheer number of Ukrainians fleeing the war in their country. 3 million in 3 weeks, and it's put an enormous strain on countries hosting them. Let's go to Peter Smith in Warsaw, the capital of Poland, which has taken in, I think, more Ukrainians than any other country in Europe. Peter, what can you tell us about the humanitarian situation in Poland, given the numbers of people coming over the border?
Well, that's right, Raggy. What we're starting to see after 3 weeks of refugees coming over the border into Poland now is a refugee crisis of its own. We've already seen, when I was reporting in Moldova, that it was a small country, one of Europe's poorest, struggling to cope with the sheer volume. Poland had more of the capacity to deal with this, the numbers that were fleeing their homes, but we're now in a situation where more than 10% of Warsaw's population is now Ukrainian refugees, and that's clearly not sustainable in the long term. I've been speaking to people working with the refugees here. We've heard from the mayor of Warsaw saying that there's a particularly acute problem here now, because at this point, Ukrainian refugees who are still in Warsaw, those are the ones who don't want to leave Poland and move on, because they're holding on. You can understand holding on dearly to the hope that their home, not so far away, they'll be able to go back home sooner rather than later. They're hoping that this war will be done and dusted and they can go back home and carry on with their lives. The mayor of Warsaw is saying that that's not the reality. That's increasingly looking like this is going to be a long-term situation, and we need to come up with a solution from the perspective of Poland. They're saying we need to come up with a solution that can be sustainable for this refugee crisis, because among those 2 million in Poland, we've got 1 million of them are children. We've been looking, that's 1 million children that need education. These are refugees that need homes, and as you can see all around me here, Raggy, this is the central station in Warsaw, and it's now starting to build up with people who are sleeping on the floor in this train station because Poland is starting to run out of accommodation. The refugee centres that they put on with tremendous support from volunteers and NGOs, people donating food and supplies to keep people going. That's been absolutely fantastic. It's run really well, but these people who are still coming into Poland 3 weeks after the war began now don't have a place to go. We've even heard about a former MP from Ukraine who came into Poland, and she's saying that she's struggling to find a place to live. She's asking families to put her up. So from what we've seen happened in Moldova very quickly, we are starting to see that emerging here in Poland now, not just a crisis from the war, but a crisis of refugees.
Briefly, Peter, I mean, there's a lot of questions here in this country about what more we can do to help Ukrainian refugees. What's the attitude of Poles there? I mean, 2 million people suddenly flooding into Poland is an extraordinary number. What do Poles think of it?
It is extraordinary, and all across Eastern Europe we've seen absolutely tremendous generosity of people often with the least to give, saying that, well, we have to give something because giving something means a lot to the people who are fleeing war in Ukraine. But we are increasingly hearing people say other parts of Europe need to do their bit, step up and offer their homes, step up and offer support. And it's not just about throwing money at the situation, because, you know, that's going to fill a gap to some extent. But the question is, again, these people, families, we're seeing, you know, mothers with children sleeping on the floor of a train station, last week they were in their homes. So this is a situation that's going to need bigger solutions for shelter, for safe haven, and also to give, again, those children access to education. And that's not necessarily going to be able to be offered in Poland in the long term. Even the Ukrainian government is trying to come up with solutions. They're saying that they don't necessarily want all of the Ukrainians who are fleeing their homes to leave the country, particularly vulnerable children in orphanages, for example. They're saying, well, you know, if those children are orphans, the state has a responsibility to them. They would rather that they were staying in safe places in Ukraine if they can, because they don't want them to be lost to the system. We've also hearing, unfortunately, about a risk of trafficking. And that's also where other parts of Europe need to step up and bring their expertise here to make sure that there's safeguarding in place, there's shelter being offered, and if possible, that the people here who don't have a place to go are then offered shelter in other parts of Europe. And we know, we've heard from speaking to people here, when we tell them how many refugees the UK has taken in, you see a look of disappointment in their faces. They're surprised that that's been the situation in the UK. That is starting to change, we know that. But certainly what we're seeing here emerge in Poland, if something doesn't change quickly, this is going to develop into a crisis of its own.
Peter, thank you very much in Warsaw. Bill, you've reported on a lot of refugee crises. These issues tend to be long-term. What do you make of what Peter was sort of saying?
Well, interesting, if Lesia Vasilenko is right, and she said this war will go on for years, months, if we're lucky, you know, a war is like an earthquake, and there are aftershocks, and what Peter has just described in Warsaw is one of the aftershocks, a refugee crisis. I mean, 1 in 5 of the population of Warsaw now potentially refugees. I was talking earlier this week to the Irish ambassador to the UK. Ireland, very small country, population 5 million, is preparing to take 100,000 refugees. Its population may go up by 2%. And I said to him, how are you going to pay for this, even if Irish people are very welcoming and so on? And he said, we have a COVID budget of €3 billion, and we think we'll be OK. We think we'll be OK. But obviously, in a year, in 2, and perhaps this is what you were getting at, asking Peter, you know, there will be tensions. Yeah. You know, Poland, look at Germany, welcomed in a million Syrian refugees. It caused Angela Merkel huge problems, possibly even led to her ouster, you know. So this is another crisis on top of war.
Thank you very much, Bill. So the question is, the man at the centre of all of this is Vladimir Putin, and what is his final aim? And what could happen in Ukraine? Mataja Neles is a political analyst who has lived in Kyiv until war broke out, and he returned to Germany. Mataja, it's a big question to sort of ask, but I suppose, you know, if you're now back in Dusseldorf in Germany and you look back at what's happening in Ukraine, and having lived amongst Ukrainians and Russians, people talk about an off-ramp for Vladimir Putin. You know, where is his exit route? Can you guess at that?
Listen, it's very difficult to see an off-ramp for a guy who basically invaded a country and started a war of annihilation, as Ukrainians see it, and as we see cities being leveled, thousands of people destroyed, about a quarter of the Ukrainian population being displaced both internally and externally, rapidly reaching Syrian levels. So it's difficult from a Ukrainian perspective, certainly, to see an off-ramp for us to offer Putin an off-ramp. But of course, there has to be a negotiated settlement, but based on very fixed red lines. And those include immediate ceasefire, withdrawal of Russian troops. And the Ukrainians have brought more negotiating chips to the table that include neutrality in terms of NATO. But they also clearly stated that they would not accept the departure or the recognition of the annexation of Crimea and the occupied territories in the east. And they still want to be part of the European family and join the European Union. So it's difficult to see how this gap between the sides can be bridged, but that's certainly what we're hoping for.
Matteo, that's really interesting what you say, because I get the impression that the longer this war has continued, the more unified Ukraine has become, the stronger its resistance, and the less willing they are to budge on what Vladimir Putin wants to end this war. That's a danger, isn't it?
That's certainly true. I've studied Ukraine for the past years, and I've never seen the society so united. Usually Ukrainians are bickering amongst themselves, and now we see 90% approval rating for the president. The country is as united as ever. So the more the Russian forces are trying to break the resistance, the more the Ukrainian resistance is in fact hardened. But that's, of course, a big question. How does this continue? If the Russians continue to pound the cities, if they, God forbid, use chemical weapons, how will the Ukrainian resistance evolve? And that's why it's important to continue their support, our support, British and Western support, for the Ukrainians to defend themselves.
Matteo, what do your friends and colleagues in Ukraine tell you? When you talk to them, what is their life like, and what do they tell you about what they want?
It's different. So I have friends and family, by the way. My wife's family is Ukrainian, and friends and family in Russia as well. But the family and friends and colleagues, it depends where they are in Ukraine, right? So in Kyiv, the mood remains defiant, supplies remain not abundantly available, but available. But in accounts from eastern Ukraine, where I have family in already occupied areas, are very different. So their supplies are running low. There is no more food in the shops in, say, Svatova and northern Luhansk, where my uncle resides. And then the people, even in cities like Severodonetsk, the capital of Luhansk Oblast, where our family and friends and colleagues reside still, they say they remain defiant. They want this war to be over, but they also are unwilling to flee. So it really depends where the people are, but the mood is very similar. They remain defiant. They want Ukraine to win this war and get out of this stronger.
Well, Bill, thank you very much, Matteo. Thank you very much indeed for that insight. Bill, what Matteo is saying is worrying in some respects, because why should Ukraine back down? That's the question the capitals will be asking themselves. Vladimir Putin's going to come with, so I'll end this war. OK, things aren't going well. I want this, and this. Why would Ukraine accede to that?
Indeed, and you could hear that in the last statement that President Zelensky made. So he called for, he didn't name Vladimir Putin, but he said it's time to meet. He clearly means Putin. No sign, by the way, that Vladimir Putin has any intention of meeting a man who he calls a Nazi. Zelensky also called for Russia to limit its damages from its mistakes. And here was the threat. This was the interesting bit. He said, otherwise, Russia's losses will be such that you will need several generations to recover. That doesn't sound like a man who wants to back down in any way. And as Matteo was saying, they may be militarily outgunned and outnumbered, but my goodness, they are giving the Russians more than a bloody nose. There seems no sense. It's the...
No one saw that coming at all, did they?
No, it's the immovable force, that's the Ukrainians, it would appear, against the thoroughly resistible, forceful object, the Russians. And as you say, nobody saw that coming. And, we don't know really what Putin means by victory. I mean, he said he wants to denazify, he wants the Russian language to be accepted, but we really don't know what his bottom line is, and this is a moment for him to decide. This is decision time. Does he double down or go for some kind of messy peace?
OK, Bill, thank you very much indeed. Well, the city of Mariupol has suffered what seems is the worst of Russian aggression, and there has been no mercy shown. In fact, it is the opposite. Just this week, a maternity hospital was attacked. Some have managed to flee the besieged city, including 17-year-old Yulia. And Martin Stew has her story.
Innocence of youth, stolen by war.
I think this thing stays with me for quite a long time.
17-year-old Yulia has escaped Mariupol, the epicenter of Russia's invasion.
There is like shh sound, and there is boom. You have to lie down on the ground, cover your ears, open your mouth. All our windows, they fell right in. There were just holes in the walls.
With temperatures dropping to -7, they moved to a shelter.
We had to cook in the yard on fire, like cavemen. It's hard to cook food when you're being bombed.
No power, no running water, no chance to rest. To escape the siege, the family packed their life into the boot of a car and ran the gauntlet by joining a convoy out of the city.
And all the time we were taking our things to the car, I was crying.
Along their road out of hell, Russian checkpoints.
On the first blog post, I was called an extremist.
Their target, videos of atrocities they don't want the world to see.
This guy stays there with a gun like hanging right on his chest, and he's telling me that I have to delete something from my phone.
Yulia's free from Mariupol, but not the war.
I don't want to leave my country, but I have no choice. I had a dream of like going to Germany and studying there, but I didn't know if I can do it. And now I have a great opportunity to go there as a refugee, if I can make it.
She'll have to do that without her mother or stepfather, who stayed home to fight. Martin Stew, ITV News.
Back to my colleague Bill Neely, who's with me in the studio. Bill, I mean, one of the things that Vladimir Putin has always tried to avoid is a united NATO, a united Europe, a united Western world. And through the last couple of weeks, that's exactly what he's got, isn't it? And
yes.
Where does he go from here?
He wants to destroy NATO and wants the United States out of Europe. And in fact, not only has he united NATO and given it back its original purpose, which of course was to keep the Russians back, the Soviets back, but he has sparked this extraordinary change in Finland and in Sweden. I mean, in Finland, for the first time, the vast majority of people want to join NATO. So I think quite soon we could see applications from Finland and Sweden. So he's done that. And in talking about NATO, next week there is a very, very important NATO and EU summit, two summits to which Joe Biden will come. We've talked about a pivotal moment for China, a time for China to decide, and a time for Putin to decide whether he's... It's also a time for NATO to decide, because some of the, for example, the security guarantees that Ukraine is looking for, terribly problematic. So Zelensky has conceded Ukraine will not be a member of NATO, but he wants security guarantees from the EU, from Germany, from Turkey, so that it will be almost NATO light. Yeah. So that Britain, for example, would guarantee that if Ukraine was attacked, that Britain and others would come to its rescue. So NATO has a big decision next week. You know, does it create that new NATO light red line? Or does it just say, we don't want World War III, as Joe Biden has said, so we will, if you like, we will fight, this is putting it very crudely, we will fight Russia to the last drop of Ukrainian blood, because we'll just keep feeding you weapons. So big decisions next week.
And do you think that there'll be other former Soviet republics like Moldova who'll be looking on at what's happening in Ukraine and thinking...
We could be next.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, Moldova, there are Russian troops in Moldova. There are Russian troops, elsewhere in former Soviet republics like Georgia. There was an 8-day war with Georgia. And also, I was talking to someone in the Balkans, in Kosovo. They are worried that Putin will change the narrative and expand the war, in a sense, by, for example, encouraging Serbia or the Bosnian Serbs to undermine the very fragile peace there. So again, pivotal moment. Does this war expand or contract?
Bill, thank you very much indeed. Well, it is just approaching 8 o'clock, and you are watching a special ITV News program on the war in Ukraine. The latest developments so far this morning. Dozens of Ukrainian soldiers have died following yesterday's Russian bomb attack on a military barracks.
І я хочу, щоб мене зараз почули всі.
As the Russian onslaught destroys his country, President Zelensky makes a fresh plea for peace. And the hard road for diplomacy as Russia seeks help from Beijing. President Biden warns the Chinese president that there will be consequences if China decides to help Putin militarily. And in Moscow, Vladimir Putin appears in an extraordinary pro-war rally as his forces continue their bombardment of Ukraine. And in Poland, it is buckling under the strain of taking in close to 2 million Ukrainian refugees. Well, good morning, and thank you for choosing to be with us this morning through our extended ITV News coverage of the latest developments on Russia's invasion and war in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin is intent on destroying Ukraine and erasing it from the face of the earth. That's the stark assessment of Ukrainian MP Lesia Vasilenko, who she told us in this programme this morning that her government now believes this conflict could continue for months, even years. Well, this is the scene right now in the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, on what is day 24 of the Russian invasion. And it's those fears of a long, drawn-out war that prompted President Zelensky to appeal to Moscow overnight, saying now is the time to talk. Both sides continue to count their losses, with the latest bloodshed claiming the lives of at least 40 Ukrainian soldiers killed when their barracks were targeted by Russian airstrikes yesterday. Hannah Miller has the latest.
A child is pulled from the rubble after a Russian attack on an army barracks in the strategic southern city of Mykolaiv. ITV News has not been able to verify these videos, but it's thought at least 40 people have died after 3 cruise missiles hit the base. It happened at such close range, said the city's mayor. There was no time for air raid sirens to get people to safety.
І я хочу, щоб мене зараз почули всі.
In the early hours of this morning, Ukraine's President Zelensky issued a rallying cry for peace from the streets and once again called for talks, with one Ukrainian MP saying arms given by the UK are helping to strengthen the country's negotiating position.
Having those kind of weapons gives us a kind of predominance on the battlefield, and I think that now we can have a whole different kind of peace talks, which will be in the interest of the Ukrainian people, and President Zelensky can hold those talks from a position of strength and of confidence.
But is President Putin losing his confidence? Bussing in an apparently adoring crowd to a Moscow football stadium yesterday, this the show he wants the world and his people to see.
Такого единения у нас давно не было.
But do they know that this is being done in their name? Urban warfare on the streets of Mariupol as pro-Russian Chechen soldiers fight house to house. They released this video of their own attack on a tower block in the besieged city. Satellite images show the utter devastation in a city where Ukrainian authorities say 90% of buildings have been damaged or destroyed, scenes described by the Red Cross as apocalyptic. In previously residential areas like this village north of Kyiv, this is the debris left behind by the military stalemate on the ground, with a warning that food supply chains across the country are now breaking down. a war that's becoming more brutal both in its methods and in the conditions it forces people to endure. Hannah Miller, ITV News.
Well, we can go to our global security editor, Rohit Kachru, who's in Kyiv. Rohit, what's Kyiv like this morning?
Well, Raggy, as you can probably hear, the air raid sirens have started again. We've not heard them for a few hours. Not precisely clear what that is in response to, but certainly, you know, we've smelt the smell of burning this morning, which is, you know, from our position here is fairly new. It's the first time in the 24 days of this invasion, this conflict, that we've sort of smelled that sort of aroma so close to the centre of the city. But I want to draw your attention to some news that we've just been hearing in the last hour. This is a claim from Russia's military of defense about an operation which it's talking about in the west of this country. They'd struck what they say was an underground ammunition depot in the Ivano-Frankivsk region of the country. But what's really significant about this is that they're saying they used the Kinzhal hypersonic missile, a hypersonic missile used perhaps, if true, for the first time in this phase of this conflict, and used so far west, which may well be a signal from the Russians to the NATO side, to Ukraine's allies, about their seriousness and their weapons arsenal as well. You know, we have heard a great deal about Russian troops apparently being demotivated, about losing momentum, but perhaps this is a signal, and maybe a really important signal at that, from the Russians to the NATO side and to the Ukrainians as well, to say, you know, this is what we have in reserve, an arsenal which includes hypersonic missiles.
Rohit, I mean, I'm just wondering, I mean, the war is at the edges of Kyiv. We've been seeing your reports and many others. Does it feel encircled? Does it feel that the war is coming ever closer to Kyiv? What's it like?
It does feel like that. You know, in many ways, life goes on a Saturday morning in Kyiv, and people are now used to this in a sense. This is the fourth weekend that people have had to live under these conditions or similar conditions. However, you know, we can see from the centre of the city on the horizon every single day fresh bombardments, artilleries. We hear almost every day this week, we've heard about shelling, about attacks on residential buildings. We were at one block of flats yesterday where several buildings were hit. A school, a nursery was struck as well, a shop completely destroyed, the glass shattered absolutely everywhere. And so people are hearing about these reports increasingly and every day now, but they're also aware of what the Russians have so far been unable to do. Let me give you an example. A town called Irpin, which we've reported from several times in the last couple of weeks, which is around 15 miles away from here. They're still struggling to take that town, a small town with a population of just 60,000 people. 2 miles from that same spot is this really crucial airfield called Hostomel. Now, on day one of this conflict, the Russians proudly proclaimed that they had taken this key site, and it really at that moment felt to many people inside the city that, yes, the Russians were advancing. They were coming for this spot because they had taken such a crucial location and had taken it so quickly. But that airfield has changed hands many times over the course of the last 3 weeks or more, and Irpin nearby still remains under the control of Ukrainian forces. And so I think there is a sense here that if the Russians can't take a town so small, then perhaps they won't successfully be able to launch an attack on this city. And that's why the news of this use of this, or claimed use by the Russians of this hypersonic weapon, gives cause for greater concern, because it really underlines the fact that, yes, the Russians have lost momentum. Yes, they're making slow progress, but they have a huge arsenal of weapons available to them. And the feeling among some of the Western allies, certainly, is that they will now, frustrated by the lack of progress so far, use those weapons increasingly and use them indiscriminately.
Rohit, stay with us. Bill, what do you make of that point by Rohit about a frustrated and angry Kremlin not able to move in on urban areas using these kind of weapons?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, if you want a visceral reminder of what it's like to be in Kyiv, we just had it there, Rohit talking about the smell of burning, and you could hear the air raid siren, and that is the reality for, I mean, there were 40 million plus Ukrainians, and that's life for them at the minute. I mean, the news, if true, of this hypersonic weapon is worrying. It is, I would say, Rohit's absolutely right. It's a signal from Moscow. Look, you keep saying that we're bogged down and maybe things aren't going as well as we thought, but we have a whole array of weapons that we haven't used yet, thermobaric, nasty weapons that we could use. And, from my experience in Syria, I mean, I was in eastern Aleppo when it fell. I have never seen anything like that. It was Stalingrad, it was Hiroshima, it was extraordinary. And that's what lies ahead if that Ukrainian MP is right, that we're in for months or years of war. So, yes, I mean, I think the Russians are probably, Plan A clearly hasn't worked, Plan B hasn't worked. They are stuck conventionally. We're coming into the spring thaw at the moment. If you thought the tanks were stuck in mud a week ago, you ain't seen nothing yet. So they have to think militarily of a different way of doing this. And
they've also lost a huge amount of manpower. So you can't commit to urban warfare if you've lost anywhere near 7,000 dead.
Just to remind viewers, 7,000 dead, possibly 20,000 injured. That is 1/10 already of their invading force in 3 weeks. And they haven't really penetrated Kyiv or Kharkiv yet. And that is urban warfare, and that will mean even more losses. So yes, they're telling everyone we've got other weapons. We're not bogged down.
Okay. Bill, thank you very much indeed, and thanks to Rohit. We will be coming back to you later. Time now to check in with Olena Genes, who's spoken to us several times in recent weeks. She lives in Kyiv with her 3 children, but she's been left caring for them single-handedly after her husband went away to fight. Olena, thank you so much indeed for joining us again. How are you and the children coping?
We keep standing with Ukraine, keep believing, keep hoping, and yes, here we are. I hope the world will let us go down like I've heard what you were talking about Aleppo and everything, and this is what we are afraid of, but our hope is strong.
How are you providing for the kids? I mean, what is daily life like? I mean, it's lovely to see the children, but as a parent, and then Bill can account for this, it's heartbreaking to see you having to bring them up in this scenario.
I mean, it's heartbreaking, but it's more heartbreaking to see what's happening right now in Mariupol, for example, where there is no heating, no electricity, no food, no medicine, nothing. Many people are still under the debris, and this is awful. Where we are right now, it's fine. So right now we are in Kyiv. Yes, we live in the basement. Yes, we hear explosions, but we are not personally hurt. We have electricity, we have water, we have food, we have supermarkets nearby that are open. We have even hospitals and pharmacies. Yesterday, I made several vaccinations for Darina, for example, in the child's hospital, because there were doctors who stay in Kyiv, keep working. There are people in the supermarkets and the pharmacies who stay and keep working. So Kyiv is so far okay. And I hope that it will not become another Mariupol in Kyiv. And I hope that the situation in Mariupol will become better. And I hope that, oh my God, that some powerful people in this world who are responsible for each other, they will not let this genocide happen.
Olena, what news of your husband, and do your children know why he's not there?
Yes, they know that their daddy joined territorial defense, that he's defending Kyiv, that they're worried a lot for him, but they send messages. They do not write, but they send him like smiles, hearts, flowers on the phone. But you see, we feel still very strong and optimistic, and this is what the kids feel. They are not victimized. They are not victims. The main emotion that they have, like Katya, for example, she's angry. She is angry with what's happening. She says that she wants to become a crocodile and eat Putin. And Taras, he said that he wants to become a cheetah and eat Putin. Me, myself, I want to become a crocodile and eat Putin, you know.
Olena, thank you so much indeed. It's a real pleasure to see you and your children. Thank you so much indeed.
You're welcome.
Olena Guinness in Kyiv with her children. The humanitarian crisis inside Ukraine and the health needs of the people who remain are becoming really acute, and countries from around the globe are contributing in any way they can. And one of those countries is Israel, which has established a field hospital in the country close to Lviv. Simona Halperin works for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and joins me from near Lviv. Simona, tell me what your country is doing and how it's doing it.
Well, good morning to you and all our viewers on this Saturday morning. I'm happy to say that Israel recruited all its basically resources, and we are from day one.
OK, Simona, we will try and come back to you. It's difficult communications. We'd like to hear more from you, and hopefully we can get the line back. But the humanitarian situation, Bill, is acute. We're hearing from Peter Smith in Warsaw earlier. We began to hear from Simona Halperin around Lviv. But if there's 7,000 dead and, Russian soldiers, one beggars belief about what's happening to Ukrainian civilians.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying earlier, there are aftershocks from war, and the refugee crisis is clearly one of those, and an issue for every country that is a neighbour of Ukraine and will be with us for some time. I think we may have Olena back. Is that?
I think so. I think we can go. Let's give it a go. No, do we not?
No,
we don't.
I actually, just to pick up on something Olena said, in war, the success of war depends not just on the hardware of one country, its army, its weapons, and so on. It also depends on what you might call software, and I think Olena just demonstrated some of that. It's about the collective will of not just the invading army, but the people that they are trying to kill in the cities. It's about patriotism, and I think perhaps that's what Vladimir Putin did not bargain for, that the collective will and the patriotism of the Ukrainians would be such. He has the hardware, but I suppose does he, with his conscript army, have the software? Do the Ukrainians have the software to resist?
Bill, we're going to go to Blackpool, where the Conservative Party are holding their spring conference, and we are joined by the Tory Party's chairman, Oliver Dowden. Mr. Dowden, thank you so much indeed for joining us. Good morning. Can you tell us, we've been hearing from Ukrainian mothers, we've been hearing from other countries in terms of what they're trying to do to help the situation, both diplomatically, militarily, and humanitarian terms. Do you think we're doing enough in terms of all of those fronts with regard to Ukraine?
Well, it is an appalling situation, what is happening in Ukraine, and my heart goes out for all the suffering of so many people unnecessarily at the hands of Putin and his brutal regime. And the UK is helping across all those fronts. We're one of the largest bilateral donors of humanitarian aid. We're getting the aid out there. In terms of the diplomatic solution, we continue to engage very closely, not just with President Zelensky, with whom the Prime Minister is in regular contact, but also with our allies in the United States and other European countries such as France and Germany. And we would, of course, support moves towards peace there if that is at all possible. But crucially, we were also helping to arm the Ukrainian forces, and the United Kingdom was the first major country to export to the Ukraine those kind of live ammunitions, those live items of defence that are being so relied on right now by Ukrainian forces.
We've spoken quite extensively about British sanctions on the Russian economy, everything from, sanctioning the central bank, British companies pulling out. Your colleague Kwasi Kwarteng has been active on this. But there is something closer to home, isn't there, with regard to the Conservative Party, and it's been, discussed, which is in terms of the Russian oligarchs who live in this country. Some of them have citizenship here. Are we doing enough to at least symbolically send out a message that they won't be tolerated in terms of their support for this war or the Kremlin?
Yes, we're sending a very strong signal in relation to that. As you know, we have a very extensive regime of sanctions against Russian oligarchs that have supported the Kremlin, I think more extensive than pretty much any country in the world. In addition to that, just last week, we toughened up unexplained wealth orders with our economic crime bill, which we rushed through Parliament at breakneck speed. We are continuing to ratchet up the pressure, both against the Russian government, against the Putin regime and his supporters around the world, including in the United Kingdom, and we will not hesitate to continue to do so.
What about those companies here, Mr. Dowden? I mean, lawyers, public relations companies, wealth fund managers who continue to do business with them. It's not just about targeting the oligarchs, it's about targeting the enablers of oligarchs.
Yes, well, I think every individual and every business needs to think very carefully about their relationship with Russia and about their relationship with supporters of the Putin regime. And I think one of the most successful things we've done in terms of ratcheting up the pressure on President Putin is the withdrawal of Western companies from Russia, is the removal of engagement with Putin and his supporters. This is really having a profound impact, and I think Putin made a number of big miscalculations, both about the strength of the resistance he'd encounter from the Ukrainian peoples, about the capacity of his army, which we have seen exposed in the Ukraine, but also about the unanimity of the Western response, not just from governments, but from Western countries and individuals. And that is what is ratcheting up the pressure on him, and that's essential in order to stop this appalling tragedy that is happening in the Ukraine.
Mr. Dowden, just stay with us, because I'd like to bring in my colleague Bill Neely, who's here. And Bill, do you want to ask Mr.
Dowden? Bill Neely here. I wanted to ask you a question about your party and about one of your donors, a woman called Lyubov Chernukin. You know who I'm speaking about. She's the wife of Vladimir Putin's former deputy finance minister, and she has given your party a lot of money, including £80,000 in just the last few months. She's given £2 million to the Conservative Party over 10 years. That is £200,000 a year. She has condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but for a lot of people in Britain, that simply isn't good enough. Are you going to get rid of her money?
I think it's really important for your viewers to appreciate that the Conservative Party complies totally with electoral law, and that means we cannot, it is illegal to take Russian money, just as it is for any political party. Now, the individual in question is actually a British citizen, and she has condemned in the most strong possible terms Putin. In fact, she's described him as Stalinist. And she
gave you her money. Why do you think she did that?
At that kind of conduct. The reason why people give money to the Conservative Party is because they want a party that gets the big calls right. We've seen that with the Prime Minister, whether that is delivering Brexit, whether that is the world-beating vaccine programme, whether that is ensuring we have an open and dynamic economy. In my experience, that is why people give money to the Conservative Party. But I think you just need to be a little bit careful about the implication you're making about this. That somehow there's some sort of corruption in respect of this person. I think these people are donating because they want to make sure that we have a good country.
Mr. Dowden, just following up on that, I mean, you're at your spring conference. Do people at your conference get it about changing the narrative with regard to Russian money, whether through sort of citizens or otherwise, and the need to sort of flush out this kind of influence?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. We need to make sure that we flush out the influence of the Putin regime in the United Kingdom. That is why we've introduced a new rapid expansion of unexplained wealth orders of the economic crime bill that we rushed through Parliament. That's why we're improving transparency in relation, for example, to overseas assets. The government is working across the board to make sure that there is no safe haven in the United Kingdom for money from people who support the Putin regime.
Mr. Dodd, just very briefly, I did make the point that Mrs. Chernyukhin has condemned the invasion, but it doesn't, I think you would accept, it doesn't look terribly good for your party. I just wonder, would it not be a good thing, for example, to take the £2 million that she's donated to you and give it to Ukrainian humanitarian causes? Wouldn't that be a good idea?
Well, the government is giving record sums of money to humanitarian causes in the Ukraine. I pay tribute to people up and down the country, including many, many Conservative members who are welcoming Ukrainians into their homes. They're making those preparations. But in respect to that individual, she is a British citizen who's condemned in the most forthright way the appalling crimes that are being committed in Russia and in the Ukraine. And I really do genuinely resent the implication that somehow that individual, and indeed anyone else who was born in Russia, should be held to account for the Putin regime. You wouldn't say the same thing, I don't think, about somebody who was born, for example, in India or in any other country. I just think we need to be careful about these are British citizens who are born in Russia, who despise the Putin regime and have been absolutely robust in standing up to it.
Oliver Dowden at the Conservative Spring Conference in Blackpool. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's return back to Simona Halperin from the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She joins me from near Lviv, where an Israeli field hospital has been put up. Simona, I think you're back with us.
I am. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, I can. Just tell us, what is your country doing and why is it doing it?
So as soon as the events in Ukraine started, we have responded to the call and request from the Ukrainian government, and we have first immediately initiated 3 planes of humanitarian assistance that it responds to the most urgent needs, which is medical supplies, water, filters, generators that are
Simona,
hospitals and water pumps.
So sorry.
Can you hear me better now? And as
Yes.
we watch now, we can see how our team on the ground is setting up the tents that will house an Israeli field hospital. In 2 days, over 100 people a day, patients that are coming, either refugee population that is moving to the western parts of Ukraine, addressing all needs, medical needs of the population that resides there and accepts the refugee population on their way. But not less important, it's going to be in collaboration with the medical authorities in Lviv Oblast. It's going to be a training center and a place where medical teams from all around Lviv Oblast and neighboring areas will be coming to learn, share experience. We're going to be able to treat patients from pediatrics, EMT, ER. We're setting up X-ray and laboratory services, pharmaceutical services, ultrasound, and obstetric.
Simona, thank you so much. I think we got a good idea of the kind of facilities that your country is trying to provide in and around Lviv, and I think it'll be operational in the next, as you were saying, 48 hours. Bill, it brings to... Go on.
Yeah, no, just shame we didn't hear from Simona, because there is another way that Israel can help. She was talking about humanitarian, but of course, in the search for peace, we are also looking for a mediator. And it is quite clear that Israel is playing, at the moment, some kind of role. Its new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, has good relations with Vladimir Putin and good relations with President Zelensky. Turkey is clearly involved in some way at the moment. There has been talk of China as a mediator. Now, I'm not quite sure how keen President Zelensky would be in that sense, but obviously the link between President Xi and President Putin is absolutely vital. If anyone can persuade President Putin to step back, it is President Xi. But interestingly, that it's not just in the humanitarian sense that Israel is or can help. It's also in the possibility of peace.
It's one of the few countries that actually has can play an interlocutor with both sides. It's 8:30. A quick look at the latest developments on the Ukraine conflict. It's thought at least 40 Ukrainian soldiers have died after a Russian bomb attack on a military barrack in Mykolaiv in the south of the country yesterday. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for fresh peace talks overnight to avoid more loss of life. And President Biden has warned the Chinese president that there will be consequences if China decides to help Putin militarily. And in Moscow, Vladimir Putin has appeared in person in an extraordinary pro-war rally as his forces continue their bombardment of Ukraine. Well, we can go live to our Asia correspondent, Debbie Edward, who is in Beijing. Debbie, we're just hearing from Bill about the possible interlocutors that could help provide a diplomatic platform for a way out of this conflict. But China, so Washington says, is preparing to help, they say, Russia militarily.
Well, yeah, I think, in my point of view, that some of that intelligence coming from the United States and from European Union officials has been perhaps misinterpreted and taken out of context. I'm in no doubt that there were deals in place and perhaps future deals for military weapon trade between the two countries. But I think I would find it a step too far, and I'll give you two reasons for that, Raghi, why I don't think China will support Russia militarily. The first is that China has a strong foreign policy of not getting involved in wars on foreign territory, and I think that China would not fathom that it would be its drones or its missiles that would be raining down on Ukrainian people. Just this week we saw China's ambassador to the Ukraine getting round the table with Ukrainian military officials in Lviv. The ambassador is still in the country, and he looked face to face across the table with those Ukrainian defense officials, and he told them that China is Ukraine's friend, and he said that China stands ready to help Ukraine following this war, helping with any rebuild efforts. So that doesn't sound like a country that's about to start supporting the Russians militarily. And second of all, as we've also heard from Rohit on several occasions and from defense experts, we know that Russia does have plenty of weaponry to keep up its assault for several weeks. What it is perhaps lacking is manpower, and certainly China will not be providing those boots on the ground.
Debbie, I'm just wondering, I mean, when you're in Beijing, do ordinary people in China, in Beijing, get a clear, unfiltered image of what is happening on the ground in Ukraine, or is it sort of filtered out as people in Russia are not being able to see what's happening on the ground?
Well, as you know, Raggy, it is state media here. It is heavily censored. But it's been interesting in the last few days that state media has started to present the true picture of what is going on in Ukraine, the true level of casualties and violence being inflicted by Russian troops. And I think part of that is because China is currently trying to evacuate around 6,000 of its own citizens from the country. A flight, the 17th flight, just arrived in China this morning. So much of the narrative is being driven by stories coming from them. But I think the overwhelming narrative, even from them, is that that NATO and the US is to blame for this. They see that NATO expansion has caused this and justified Russia's invasion of the country. And the opinion here has not been pro-Russia, it hasn't been pro-Ukrainian, it has been overwhelmingly anti-America, anti-NATO.
Thank you, Debbie. No surprise there, Bill, I suppose, when what Debbie was sort of saying.
No, because I suppose, you know, geopolitically, both China and Russia have the same aim, which is to knock the United States off its perch. It doesn't want a unipolar world anymore. What they want to be seen as equal partners. So, yes, no surprise there. I mean, I think in the Chinese media, we've had two things. We've had them repeating some Russian disinformation about US biolabs operating in Ukraine, some of the apparent disinformation that's coming from Moscow, and yet, you know, at the same time, we see China repeating its old lines that NATO's to blame. Again, a Russian talking point.
Bill, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's go to Washington and Kate Fisher. And more on that lengthy, I should say 2-hour-long phone call between President Xi and President Biden yesterday. Kate, what's the mood like in sort of Washington in terms of that conversation, and any change in the US position with regard to Ukraine and China's influence in it?
Well, it was interesting actually listening to Debbie just there, because I think there's a much more kind of negative feeling after that phone call between the two leaders about what China may be considering doing in Ukraine. As you say, the President Biden, President Xi spoke for nearly 2 hours on Friday morning here. And yet after the end of that phone conversation, there was very little substantive progress from either side, really, about whether President Biden had managed to persuade President Xi away from considering that help to the Russians. The White House said that it was a direct, substantive and detailed conversation, yet they said in a press conference afterwards, Jen Psaki, the press secretary for the White House, said that they still had concerns about what President Xi was considering. So they didn't feel confident that President Biden had managed to persuade him not to do that. They are still concerned about what he could do and his seeming still kind of alignment with Russia. And as you mentioned there, it is this whole thing about they no longer want to see America leading the world. They do not want the West in charge of the global order. And this alignment between Russia and China is really concerning for the White House. And they did make it clear that they are not confident that they've done enough to persuade President Xi yet. They said they're just going to have to see what happens in the coming days, which didn't really inspire that much confidence.
But Kate, I mean, I suppose in some sense, I mean, President Biden's got a problem, hasn't he, in the sense that there is considerable building of sentiment within the United States and most importantly on Capitol Hill in Congress about further, pressure on Russia and also, if necessary, on China. And so, he's going to face more calls for following up on what he says will be consequences for China if they support Russia militarily.
Yeah, absolutely. And the White House, the State Department, the White House have been clear that there will be these consequences, this punishment, should China go ahead and give material support to Russia. But in a background call with reporters, the White House would not lay out to us what those consequences would be. So we don't know any details of that, but we can assume it would be sanctions similar to those that were imposed on Russia. And that is a huge risk for Washington because unlike Russia, China is this huge global economic player. It's the second, the US and China, the two biggest economies in the world. And if the US starts sanctioning China, that is going to have huge effects, not just on the economy in the US, but across the world. So they know that they've got this really difficult fine line to balance in deciding how they would punish China if they go ahead with that. I think they're hoping that this will act as a huge deterrent, a bit like, say, a nuclear weapon, that they don't actually want to use it, but they're hoping the thought of it is enough to make China think twice. And of course, China's economy is struggling at the moment. So there is a big decision for President Xi to take as well, how does he manage? He wants to kind of stay aligned with Russia, but maintain some level of relations with the West. But I think President Biden is saying to him, that is simply not possible. And you need to make more. President Xi has not condemned President Putin. He has not talked even about an invasion. He just terms this as a crisis in Ukraine. And President Biden, I think, during that call yesterday was really trying to say, you can't sit on the fence anymore. You've got to use your influence with Vladimir Putin to try to get him to bring those troops home.
OK, Kate in Washington, thank you very much indeed. Bill, it's a sort of extraordinary moment where you've got these, a pitch for world sort of opinion by Vladimir Zelensky, who's been incredibly effective in his communication, addressing Congress, addressing the Bundestag, the House of Parliament, and then Vladimir Putin suddenly appearing at this war rally yesterday, and in the middle of it, Joe Biden.
Yes, I mean, who's exactly is winning the information war at the moment? I mean, I think President Zelensky is playing an absolute blinder. First speech to the House of Commons invoking Churchill, then he talks to the US Congress, invokes Pearl Harbor and 9/11, talks to the Bundestag and reminds them of the Berlin Wall and says, tear down this new wall, and also scolds them for their previous policy. And it's such an emotional speech that the translator at the German Bundestag almost broke down. So extraordinary vigour. I mean, here's a man in his 40s. And interesting hearing from Washington. In Washington, there is a severe case of presidential envy. Yeah. They're looking at this young, dynamic leader and, whether you're Democrat or Republican, you are looking at a sclerotic political array, which gives you either President Biden or looks like his chief challenger, Donald Trump, both in their mid to late 70s. And it's interesting, we've been talking about this is a pivotal moment for everybody. I think it's a pivotal moment, actually, for Joe Biden as well, because he has been criticised up to now. People saying, well, you've told us what America won't do. I mean, it's almost a curious inversion of setting a red line. A red line is, here's what we will do if you do this. But he's been setting a red line of, OK, here's what we won't do. And a lot of people in the United States...
With no-fly zones,
It's not World War III. We're not going to set up a no-fly zone, no American boots on the ground. So I think for Joe Biden and next week at NATO, it is an important moment of deciding, OK, that's what we won't do. What will we do? Now, of course, he has announced an extraordinary $1 billion of military aid, including Stinger missiles, these extraordinary shoulder-held anti-tank missiles, 20 million rounds. Which have been
very effective.
Very effective, 20 million rounds of ammunition, yes, very effective. Thinking back to Afghanistan, if there was one weapon that defeated the Soviet Union, it was the RPG, shoulder-held. And if there's one weapon that the Ukrainians are loving at the moment, shouldn't say that because it's about killing people, but it is the shoulder-held anti-tank missile, which Britain, to its credit, has been supplying a great deal of and did so first and in January. But yes, coming back to Biden, I think for him too, it's a pivotal week.
And also just huge amounts of pressure building within Congress. I mean, you saw that after the address to Congress by President Zelensky. it resonated with Americans.
It did, and it's certainly going too far to say that there's a new sense of unity in America, because the country is divided probably as never before. But again, you know, Vladimir Putin has given Americans a sense of what their foreign policy should be for. And for Joe Biden, after the Afghanistan debacle, that botched pullout, this is a moment to prove what he can do in foreign policy, and a lot of Republicans are willing him on to do more.
Thanks, Bill. There has been a little light in these dark times which have descended over Ukraine, and for the few, they are savouring every moment with loved ones who have managed to seek sanctuary abroad. Rusty, a doctor from Bristol, has been reunited with his sister and nieces. They met in Poland and then travelled on to Ireland, and our correspondent Rupert Evelyn reports on one family reunion.
After weeks filled with fears and anxiety, the simplest of moments have added weight. Bristol doctor Rusty is presented with a picture drawn by his niece. She has fled from Ukraine. The image shows her with her mum and uncle, a family finally together. They were all reunited in Poland at the beginning of this week. To understand what that meant was, Rusty told me, to understand love.
I was a bit emotional myself. It's just finally I just realized how much I love them, how much I miss them. You never appreciate that when their lives are not in danger, and when everything goes as smoothly, and when there is stability. When there is some risk or instability, you quite understand what they mean for you.
His sister and nieces fled Ukraine with a family friend and her children. Because Britain's resettlement programme is not quite ready to receive them all, they headed to Ireland, a journey that included officials waving them through despite some expired passports.
It was probably the most stressful 2 minutes of my life. And on his way back, I saw a massive smile on his face. So he was really hoping to get us through, and he was given that green light by his supervisor, and we boarded.
For all those Ukrainians who fled, there are many more left behind.
My parents still, very keen to stay in Ukraine, and I offered them to bring them over almost every day, and they say, no, we'll stay.
You'll still ask?
I still ask. I hope they change their mind one day. There's a lot of uncertainty. I think my sister and her family, and Irina and her family probably don't realize them. Maybe they do, but maybe don't fully appreciate that there is a possibility they'll never see their husbands again, and they may never go back to Ukraine.
For now, though, they are safe, warm and welcome in Ireland. In these insecure times, they have security and are able to move freely without fear of attack. Rupert Evelyn, ITV News.
Story of a family reunion in Ireland. Now to the response from British businesses offering practical help to the crisis. More than 100 big-name companies have signed up with the promise of jobs for Ukrainian refugees once they arrive on our shores. It all follows a campaign by the entrepreneur Emma Sinclair, and I'm delighted to say she joins me now. Emma, have you been surprised by just how many companies have come forward with this a surprising offer of generosity?
Not surprised at all. Entrepreneurs like myself are used to busting through red tape. Companies are used to having huge experience of solutions about recruitment, CV skills, school supplies, language, and really the government's part is infrastructure and logistics. So companies, just like individuals, are desperate to do their part.
Emma, do you think, the other side, the other flip side of that is about the reputational damage of very big companies continuing to work in Russia? We've seen a huge exodus of British and international companies leaving Russia. What do you think about that? Because obviously it's going to impact ordinary Russians.
Yes, look, I'm one person and I have tremendous support from corporates all over the UK. My focus and all I can think about is that there are people on border towns, there are people that come from other parts of the world already in the United Kingdom who don't have the right to work, who want to learn English, who want to resettle. So my focus is on making sure that actually we do better, that the government do better, and that we help people who want to get to these shores to do so, and to be able to start a life with dignity. I think the other thing to bear in mind is, we talked about business. There are over 1.3 million job vacancies in the United Kingdom. There are thousands of Afghans already here with no right to work. There are thousands of Ukrainians who want to come here and be part of the economy and set up an independent life where they can support themselves. So that's where I'm focusing my effort and attention.
And do you think that, businesses can help in terms of, there are people we've been hearing all this morning, forced to flee their country, obviously a lot of them wanting to go back. But can businesses really help in the short term in terms of providing them with the UK with not just a place of refuge, but a place to have, dignity and work?
Yes, I think definitely. There are three things there. Firstly, the Commons will be voting on Tuesday on whether to reverse the Lord's amendment to the border bill and the right to work. I hope that we don't see that. The second thing is, what can businesses actually do? Because that is what the attention of this group of people wanting to help the government to move faster and give them a little push and a little nudge is we will shortly be announcing a collection of programs that are being scaled up, where businesses will be able to sponsor companies, sponsor individuals who come here, sponsor refugees with 6 months of English classes and help them to have English skills, language skills, resettlement skills. If you were a dentist, nurse when you were in Ukraine or wherever you come from, let's help you get the certification you need to be able to do that in the United Kingdom. There are so many resources available to businesses and so much goodwill. It's not the government that we expect to do this alone, but we do expect the Home Office to start to provide some immediate and urgent clarity about how people can get here and how people can get a job.
Speaking of clarity, Emma, very briefly, there'll be people listening to this who own their own businesses. Where do they go if they're interested in this initiative to get some information about helping?
Thank you. Well, you mentioned the promise of jobs at the beginning. No, what we're looking to do is to make sure that all those jobs are available, in the United Kingdom, are suitable and have the infrastructure around them to allow people that don't speak English who've just arrived to do them. There will be a collection of initiatives announced next week, some blueprints for how companies can do this at scale. A handful of companies that will be announcing will be taking the first steps to sponsor people when they get here and make sure that they have the support and are work ready and have the opportunity for employment at the end of it if they're ready. It's the next step, and the next throw of the dice is from the government and the right to work before anybody can do anything material.
OK, Emma, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and good luck with that initiative.
Thank you.
And following the invasion of Ukraine, it seems the diplomatic tectonic plates are shifting fast, especially when it comes to the thawing of relations with countries such as Iran, which this week allowed Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Anousheh Ashouri back to the UK. Someone instrumental in talking to Nazanin during her darkest days is former hostage Terry Waite, who joins me now. Terry, thank you very much indeed. Good morning to you. Let's just come to Nazanin's release. You were in touch with her while she was incarcerated. And I think you spoke to us a couple of days ago where you described how she almost lost hope, but you told her it will happen, she will come home.
Well, Nazanin has been extremely brave and courageous through this whole miserable episode. But when she was released from prison and went to her parents' home in Tehran, she was tagged. And I was quite surprised that I was able to have conversation with her across the internet and also by email. And the main purpose of that, of course, was to assure her that there were still many, many people across this country and beyond who were thinking of her and hoping for her release, and also to help her maintain hope. And then, just 4 days before she was released, and of course none of us had any idea that she was going to be able to come home then, I got an email from her in which she said that Iran New Year was approaching and she was feeling a little low because she said, another year without seeing my daughter. And all I could say, knowing absolutely nothing about the release, was, don't worry, Nazanin, this event will be over, I assure you, you will be back. And then, of course, 4 days later, mercifully, she was released and returned home to her family.
Terry, you were kept hostage for many years in Lebanon by allies of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I mean, you've written about it, you've spoken about it. Does the fact that we have paid this historic debt to Iran, £400 million, which we owed from, 1979, does it feel like a ransom to you? And how does it make you feel in terms of what you went through?
Well, first of all, I mean, my first thoughts on that are that all over the world, we see it in Ukraine, we see it with hostages. These are innocent victims of large-scale political machinations, I might even say political corruption, on all sides. And Nazarene has been affected by that. To me, it does not seem a ransom payment, although it can be interpreted that way. But it is quite clear that the payment was payment of a debt, a very long-standing debt, which goes back, 40 years to the time of the Shah and to the time before I was in Iran, bringing home hostages. So it's a very long-term debt. And of course, that debt has been used by Revolutionary Guards. The problem with it, of course, now is if it's interpreted that way as a payment of blood money, so to speak, we have to remember that there are other hostages there too. There are other people in prison. How are they going to be, how is their release going to be secured? All sorts of complications. But the whole history of this debt and the debt payment is one of absolute misery, corruption and duplicity. And it is a terrible, terrible thing. And of course, Nazarene and others have been caught in that duplicity.
Terry, I mean, as you said, there is a bigger and complicated and often unpleasant, bigger picture in all of this. Iran is quite central in terms of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia because of its relations with Moscow. I want to bring in my colleague Bill Neely, who wants to address that issue.
Yeah, I just wonder, is the release of Nazanin just an event on its own, or is Iran possibly sending some kind of signal? I mean, her imprisonment is a signal in itself of the ruthlessness of the Iranian regime, but Iran is now involved in nuclear talks. We had heard just before the Ukraine crisis that possibly there could be a deal within weeks. And Russia would be part of that deal. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, this week signalling that his country would not scupper those talks. But I wonder, does Terry have any thoughts on the bigger picture? Whether he thinks the release of Nazanin has, anything to do with anything beyond just her and this historic debt?
Of course, I have no inside knowledge at all, and I'm speaking purely in a personal capacity. But it does seem to me that it's absolutely vitally important that we build relationships with Iran, not just for economic reasons, but when you look at the history of the relationship of the United Kingdom with Iran, it's tragic. I mean, it goes back to the days of Mossadegh, when Mossadegh was overthrown. Legitimately, as I understand it, the elected politician who was overthrown in a coup. And it was all centered around, of course, oil. And that's the key to it at the moment, oil. And, we do need to build relationships. And it's going to take some doing. But then, of course, economics and a powerful force, and they, in some ways, control the scene.
Thank you, Terry Waite. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, now the city of Mariupol has suffered what seems is the worst of Russian aggression. There's been no mercy shown. In fact, the opposite. Just this week, a maternity hospital was attacked and some have managed to flee the besieged city, including 17-year-old Yulia. And Martin Stew has her story.
Innocence of youth stolen by war.
I think this thing stays with me for quite a long time.
17-year-old Yulia has escaped Mariupol, the epicenter of Russia's invasion.
There is like shh sound, and there is boom. You have to lie down on the ground, cover your ears, open your mouth. All our windows, they fell right in. There were just holes in the walls.
With temperatures dropping to -7, they moved to a shelter.
We had to cook in the yard on fire, like cavemen. It's hard to cook food when you're being bombed.
No power, no running water, no chance to rest. To escape the siege, the family packed their life into the boot of a car and ran the gauntlet by joining a convoy out of the city.
And all the time we were taking our things to the car, I was crying.
Along their road out of hell, Russian checkpoints.
On the first blog post, I was called an extremist.
Their target, videos of atrocities they don't want the world to see.
This guy stays there with a gun like hanging right on his chest, and he's telling me that I have to delete something from my phone.
Yulia's free from Mariupol, but not the war.
I don't want to leave my country, but I have no choice. I had a dream of like going to Germany and studying there, but I didn't know if I can do it. And now I have a great opportunity to go there as a refugee, if I can make it.
She'll have to do that without her mother or stepfather, who stayed home to fight. Martin Stew, ITV News.
Well, good morning. It's 9 o'clock and you're watching a special ITV News programme on the war in Ukraine. The latest developments so far this morning. Dozens of Ukrainian soldiers have died following yesterday's Russian bomb attack on a military barracks.
І я хочу, щоб мене зараз почули всі.
As the Russian onslaught destroys his country, President Zelensky makes a fresh plea for peace. President Biden warns the Chinese president that there will be consequences if China decides to help Vladimir Putin militarily. And in Moscow, Vladimir Putin appears in person in an extraordinary pro-war rally as his forces continue their bombardment of Ukraine. And Poland is buckling under the strain after taking in close to 2 million Ukrainian refugees. Good morning and thank you for being with us this morning. Vladimir Putin is intent on destroying Ukraine and erasing it from the face of the earth, the Ukrainian MP Lesia Vasilenko told us this morning. It follows further fierce fighting with Mariupol once again the focal point. Right now, Ukrainian forces there are battling Russian troops for control of one of the largest steel plants in Europe. Both sides continue to count their losses. Now 40 Ukrainian soldiers are known to have died when their barracks were targeted by Russian airstrikes yesterday. Hannah Miller has the latest.
A child is pulled from the rubble after a Russian attack on an army barracks in the strategic southern city of Mykolaiv. ITV News has not been able to verify these videos, but it's thought at least 40 people have died after 3 cruise missiles hit the base. It happened at such close range, said the city's mayor. There was no time for air raid sirens to get people to safety.
І я хочу, щоб мене зараз почули всі.
In the early hours of this morning, Ukraine's President Zelensky issued a rallying cry for peace from the streets and once again called for talks, with one Ukrainian MP saying arms given by the UK are helping to strengthen the country's negotiating position.
Having those kind of weapons gives us a kind of predominance on the battlefield, and I think that now we can have a whole different kind of peace talks, which will be in the interest of the Ukrainian people, and President Zelensky can hold those talks from a position of strength and of confidence.
But is President Putin losing his confidence? Bussing in an apparently adoring crowd to a Moscow football stadium yesterday, this the show he wants the world and his people to see.
Такого единения у нас давно не было.
But do they know that this is being done in their name? urban warfare on the streets of Mariupol as pro-Russian Chechen soldiers fight house to house. They released this video of their own attack on a tower block in the besieged city. Satellite images show the utter devastation here as Ukrainian authorities say 90% of buildings have been damaged or destroyed, scenes described by the Red Cross as apocalyptic. And looming over the city, what will remain of one of Europe's largest steel factories. As Ukrainian and Russian forces fight over a plant that's been firing the economy here since the 1930s, its fate an emblem of the destruction that is shattering this country. Hannah Miller, ITV News.
Well, it's 9:03 in London, 11 in Kyiv, where our global security editor, Rohit Khatri, joins me now. Rohit, is there, waking up Saturday morning where you are, any developments militarily or in terms of the war?
Yeah, I mean, several significant developments from different parts of the country. And one that I want to draw your attention to this morning is news that we've just heard from the Russian military about something that happened yesterday. What they're claiming is that when they destroyed a suspected ammunition warehouse belonging to the Ukrainian military, they used their Kinzhal hypersonic aviation system. Now, why that's so significant is that it would be the first use of a hypersonic missile in this phase of this conflict, and also the location so far west. You know, this might be interpreted as being a signal not only to the Ukrainians but to NATO allies about the seriousness of the Russian assault at a time when so many of the key NATO countries are indicating that they believe that the Russians are being bogged down. We heard from British officials late yesterday who were saying just that, saying that they believe that the strategy for the Russians has now changed, that they're now pursuing a war of attrition because they have become so bogged down over the course of the last 3 weeks or more. The flip side of this is that we hear this morning of the death of a fifth general being claimed by the Ukrainian military. Really unusual, perhaps even surprising for such a high number of senior Russian generals to have been killed on the battlefield. Particularly significant because what NATO allies say is that the Russian military has a particularly centralized command structure, which means that the impact of taking out one senior figure in the Russian military might be the equivalent of several similar senior figures on the Ukrainian side. So we have these developments right across the country, and a sense that actually as the Russians try to approach cities like this, and as they find it increasingly difficult with this finite number of precision weapons, that they may be forced in their own minds to turn increasingly towards indiscriminate attacks, the sort of thing we've seen here in the city of Kyiv and that we've seen in places like Mariupol this week.
OK, Rohit, thank you very much indeed. To Bill in the studio with me. Bill, I mean, you've reported from many wars. I've never heard of a war in which 5 generals of a major power were killed on the front lines.
No, it is extraordinary in 3 weeks. And just to add to what Rohit was saying, this general is a rank above the other 4. So he is the highest ranking military figure. It's almost been confirmed from several sources that he is dead. He's the highest-ranking Russian general so far. Interesting that he was killed in Kherson. Now, Kherson was the very first city or town that Russia claimed to have taken, and yet the Ukrainians appear to have killed him at Kherson airport. And he was the man who commanded Russian forces in Donbass since 2017. So symbolically as well, the Ukrainians appear to have picked off someone who's very important. And just news coming through as we've been on air, it would appear that a new batch of missiles has been flown in from Russia to Belarus, which would again suggest that they are running low on missiles and that this is indeed a time for resupply. That the talks, for example, that have been going on, perhaps looking at them cynically, are just a chance to
replenish,
to replenish, rather than not to end the war, but to just resupply and regroup.
Strategic pause.
Yes.
OK, Bill, thank you very much indeed. Well, on to the humanitarian consequences of the war in Ukraine, and the sheer number of people fleeing the war is putting an enormous strain on some of the countries hosting them. Let's go to Peter Smith, who's in Warsaw in Poland. Peter, how is Poland coping with the extraordinary number of Ukrainians seeking refuge there?
Until now, Raggy, it's been coping admirably. The kindness of strangers here, taking people in, taking in families, the schools opening their doors to the children. But the numbers are, well, they speak for themselves. 3 million Ukrainians are believed to be refugees. Already 2 million of them in Poland, 1 million of them children. And those numbers, the sheer numbers of them coming in and still coming in 3 weeks after the war began, Poland is starting to feel the strain. I'm actually joined now by Kuba, a volunteer from Grupa Centrum. Kuba, you're helping Ukrainians arrive here to find accommodation in Warsaw, where 1 in 5 of the population is now a Ukrainian refugee. So what are you telling the new Ukrainian refugees when they arrive here?
So as you mentioned, together with the other volunteers, we try to do our best to help the refugees with finding some good accommodation options in Poland and as well in other countries. And currently, as you mentioned, we are experiencing a situation when Warsaw is overcrowded. So we try to encourage the refugees to look for some options also outside of Warsaw and other countries as well. That is not always easy. We try to help them with transport and other options, but the situation is difficult.
Why are so many of the Ukrainian refugees so keen to stay here in Warsaw?
Because of the high level of uncertainty. They do not know how long will be the war. They do not know if they basically can go home in 1 month, 2 months, or in 1 week. And places like Warsaw are good for good points for transport, yes, so they can easily get from here back to Ukraine if needed.
So they believe that they'll be going home
yes,
soon?
Exactly.
Are you trying to convey that message that this now could be a long-term situation and they have to consider relocating?
Definitely. We are in a similar situation. We do not know how long will be the war. So, we try to do our best with the other volunteers to help them find both short-term and long-term accommodation.
Where are you starting to feel the pressure?
Currently we are experiencing some kind of pressure with infrastructure, especially with the long-term accommodation right now. But more and more people ask for work, for job, and it's also not easy to organize it in an efficient way for such many people.
You really are trying your best. I'm seeing extraordinary efforts from the volunteers here to find people safe shelter, safe haven. From your perspective, we've discussed the numbers that, for example, the UK has taken in. What do you think of the international effort to support Poland?
Well, I think we need lots of help. There are 2 million refugees currently in Poland, and we are 38 million country. It's obvious that this is a huge number of people that we are trying to help right now, but without the big support and real help from the other countries, we won't be able to provide all with the high level service and quality of help.
And you've done so well so far, but it's not sustainable.
Well, we have our limits, yes, our infrastructure looking from very different perspectives, like, for instance, accommodation, transport, etc., schools. It has its own limits, so we need to basically send people also from Warsaw, from Poland to other countries, so that you in UK and in other countries, our friends in our other countries, they have an option to help and take some responsibility for this very difficult situation.
Well, thank you very much, Kuba. It's a powerful message. What we've seen here, what I'm witnessing on the ground, the extraordinary efforts of these volunteers, but the message is really clear to the international community, particularly Western Europe. Now is the time to step up and step in to help these Ukrainian families.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Now, the reverberations of the war are being felt far and wide, and closer to home. Chelsea Football Club is up for sale, and multiple offers have now been made for the West London club after its Russian owner, Roman Abramovich, was sanctioned by the UK government. Last night, a deadline passed for bids for the club. They include a group led by ex-Liverpool chairman Sir Martin Browman and London 2012 boss Lord Seb Coe, who vowed under their charge Chelsea would never again face a fight for their future. We're joined now by the Chelsea icon, Pat Nevin. Pat, what do you make of what's gripping Chelsea Football Club at the moment?
That's quite a wide question. Certainly, a lot of people felt there was an existential crisis. I actually didn't think that myself. I knew that this was a club that's a huge asset, not just the ground where it is, but also the fact that they're European and World Club champions just now. They've got a history, particularly the last 20 years, that's quite incredible. So it's an asset that a lot of people would like to own. And when you add the other sides to it, it is now one of the most famous clubs in the world, and that it's up for sale, and the fact that, lots and lots of people, up to 20 bidders will have made bids before yesterday afternoon. I've never been really worried about its future, but the hope is that it gets sorted as soon as possible. The problem is you want it done as soon as possible because, you've got cash flow problems, which could cause all sorts of difficulties this season, but also you want the due diligence to be done. So you do want it done quickly, but you also don't want it done quickly. You want the best bidder, you want the right bidder, but not necessarily the highest bidder.
But Pat, let me ask you, do you worry about the sort of reputational damage to Chelsea far and wide? Because it's been under our nose, let's be honest, and when you hear Roman Abramovich's name being sung out, I know Chelsea are playing later today, does it make you feel uncomfortable?
And yes, I wrote about it on the Chelsea website, how incredibly uncomfortable everybody was with that. I understand the Chelsea fans, they say, he's been very generous towards their club. Yeah, but it's so inappropriate just now. And I really would urge Chelsea fans not to be saying that, particularly when we're having moments of applause for the Ukrainians who are battling so bravely at the moment under such a grotesque attack from the Russians. So absolutely, it's not the time to be doing that just now. And you talk about, the Russian involvement for all these years. I look at the bidders just now, and I have this horror that there's a Saudi Arabian bid, and I'm thinking, I don't know which bid I want. I know which one I don't want. Chelsea can't be going down that road again. And I suspect in the fact that there will be, input from the government as well, they will look at, again, as I say, the best owners going forward. There's plenty of clubs and there's plenty of businesses and there's even governments around the world who can look at some of the things they've done and where they've got the money and can feel incredibly uncomfortable. What Chelsea fans would like now and what Chelsea Football Club generally would like now going forward is not to have those sorts of worries. I think the problem is, and if we're not going to be completely ironic about it, try finding a billionaire that hasn't got a skeleton in the cupboard. It's not easy.
Pat, thank you very much indeed. Pat Nevin talking to me. Now, the Putin regime has been hit by tough sanctions, but those haven't prevented the Russians from launching their deadly onslaughts and the targeting of civilians. Vladimir Putin has many enemies, and one of them is the anti-corruption campaigner and businessman Bill Browder. Bill, it's great to have you on the programme. I should preface by giving a little bit of a background because it's important. You were one of the first and early investors in Russia at the fall of communism. You ran a very successful investment fund. And then in 2009, one of your colleagues, your lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, came across a huge fraud. He was imprisoned and he died. And as a result of that, you vowed to try to crack down on rotten Russian money, which you've described, and it became known as the Magnitsky Act in his name. You've always said from the beginning, and you were a lone voice for many years, that the way to really hobble the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin was to go after the money that he has and those around him have. Describe to us what you mean by that and whether the sanctions are doing that.
Well, so we're at this point in time, we're trying to find any way possible to put pressure on Vladimir Putin to stop this murderous, horrifying invasion. And one of Vladimir Putin's Achilles heel is that he has, over the last 20 years, stolen an enormous amount of money from the Russian people. And I'm talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. He doesn't keep that money in his own name. He keeps that money in the name of people he trusts, who are oligarchs. And those people hold that money for Vladimir Putin in the West. And so as we're looking for ways to go after Vladimir Putin, other than putting troops on the ground, one of Vladimir Putin's main Achilles heel is this money he holds in the West. And one of the ways of going about it is to freeze the assets of the oligarchs, because that's freezing his assets. And it may not have an immediate effect, because at this point in time, Vladimir Putin is a guy who doesn't back down. He doesn't show weakness. He doesn't show that he's made a mistake. But by freezing this money, it will degrade his ability to execute this war, because he won't have access to this enormous pot of money that he has offshore.
Yeah, Bill, I'm going to bring in my colleague, Bill Neely, but you're talking about not just going after the oligarchs. You have to go after the lawyers, the fund managers, the bankers, the public relations. There's a massive amount of industry in this city, London, that has profited by that. That's not easy.
That's definitely not easy, and it is part of the problem. So we've spent the last, in the UK, where I've lived, the UK has spent the last 22 years or so welcoming Russian money. There's a whole sort of major infrastructure of people here to help the Russians hide their money, launder their reputation, attack anybody who wants to out them. These are the enablers, the Western enablers, and these lawyers, PR firms, concierges, security people, private investigators, all need to be exposed and all need to stop doing this going forward, because, and it's not just for the Russians. It's we were just talking a moment ago about Saudi Arabia and China and other hostile regimes. This should not be the world's money laundering center. This should not be the center of villains around the world to come and settle and keep their money.
Bill, it's Bill Neely here. The British government had a fairly slow start in the last few weeks in sanctioning people, oligarchs and so on. Do you think they're doing enough now? I mean, the government is saying we have sanctioned around 1,000 individuals or entities. I wonder what exactly you think that means and whether it's enough. Should the government be doing more? Is it effective?
Well, going after oligarchs and so on is very simple to do. This 1,000 number is completely misinterpretation. There's about a dozen, somewhere between a dozen and 20 real oligarchs, the people that we care about, the people who hold the money, the people that matter, that have been sanctioned. And there are about 100 that need to be sanctioned. You know, you can pick random names out of the phone book. You can pick generals or members of parliament. They're not the ones with the money. You need to go after the people with the money. There's 100 or so that need to be sanctioned. I would say, though, and I'm always critical of the government when it comes to enforcing sanctions, that the names they've picked so far are high-value names. They're the real high-value targets. They're the people who have a lot of money, and these people are all sort of part of Putin's inner circle. But then the list needs to be expanded. And from what I can see, the government has every intention of expanding the list. This is just the beginning of the process. And so presuming that the government continues to expand the sanctions list, and I should also point out that it can't just be the oligarchs themselves. It has to be their family members, their wives, children's parents, who are holding money for them. At that point, once you've kind of gotten all these people with their assets frozen, it completely dries up one major portion of money that Vladimir Putin has access to fund this war.
Very briefly, Bill, you're saying that the government's figure of 1,000 individuals or entities is inflated, doesn't mean much.
Well, I mean, if you pick 1,000 people out of the phone book, you can have 1,000 people. But what matters is the people who matter. And if you take the people who matter, and it's pretty simple, you just go pick up the Forbes list, the Russian Forbes list of the 100 richest people. And if there's a few, one or two or three or four honest people on that list, but the rest of them are effectively cronies of Putin that have gotten rich because of Putin, that hold Putin's money, and who should be sanctioned. And what I'm saying is that of that list, only about a dozen, perhaps a little bit more than a dozen, are actually on the UK sanctions list at the moment.
Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Well, the Prime Minister will address his party's spring conference in Blackpool later today, and our political reporter Shihab Khan is there. Shihab, what do you expect Boris Johnson to say, particularly pertaining to Ukraine?
So the Prime Minister, as you say, will be delivering a speech to his party members today at Blackpool. Ukraine has been the big topic. It's the thing the government is battling with most. It's at the top of the agenda at the moment. And there'll be an expectation that he outlines the help that the country has already given Ukraine and what more is to come. Now, he actually ran past us a few moments ago as he was going for his morning jog. He wasn't too keen to stop and talk then, but looking through the agenda for today, he's not the only one that's talking. There's also going to be speeches from the Home Secretary, from the Defence Secretary, from the Foreign Secretary, all one after another. And it appears as though that the most senior members of the Cabinet who are responsible for Britain's response to the invasion are all talking more or less in coordination with one another. Now, there's been criticism of the government for the way in which it's handled the refugee crisis, in particular the speed in which refugees have been welcomed into the United Kingdom, the number of visas that have been given. Now, that is likely to be discussed today. Ultimately, these speeches are being given to a room of party supporters and party members. This isn't an opportunity to be particularly critical or for scrutiny of government policy. Instead, it is a warm reception that's being expected from people that ultimately vote for the government and vote for the party. Now, fundamentally, what we're hoping to see from the Prime Minister is an outline of the discussions he's had with the Ukrainian government, of what's to come. We saw him yesterday talking at the Scottish Conservative Party conference where he did say and he pledged to do more. Now, something else that will be on the agenda today is his response to the comments that were made by Jacob Rees-Mogg, who suggested that Partygate was a bit of political fluff. That could be the tricky thing, but we'll have to wait and see whether or not the Prime Minister addresses it today.
Shihab in Blackpool, thank you very much indeed. Now, let's get you up to speed with some of the latest news coming out of Ukraine. The Russian military says it's used its latest hypersonic missile, Kinzhal, for the first time in combat. It came as it published new footage of continuing airstrikes within its ongoing invasion of Ukraine. And it's been announced 10 humanitarian corridors have been agreed by Ukraine and Russia. They include a corridor from the besieged port city of Mariupol, as well as several in Kyiv or Luhansk. And Bill Neely is with me. Bill, we've been on air since 7 o'clock. What are the main things that our viewers need to know on day 24 of this invasion?
Well, I think one of the whole military questions is the Russian military bogged down? We don't know that, but we do know that they are sustaining extraordinary casualties. We've been hearing from US intelligence that it could be a figure of 7,000 dead, 20,000 injured. That would represent 1 in 10 of the invasion force, which in any war after 3 weeks is quite extraordinary. We've been hearing this morning fairly confirmed reports that a 5th Russian general has died, the highest-ranking general to be killed, and he died in a place where the Russians, in Kherson, the first city that the Russians say that they took. So it illustrates, I think, that you might be able to take a city, but can you keep it? If there is if they do take other cities, can you hold on against an insurgent campaign that the Ukrainians will undoubtedly mount? And I think, we're entering a really important week with a NATO summit and an EU summit, but also decision time for President Xi of China. Does he
throw his lot in?
Does he throw his lot in? Has he backed the wrong horse? Does he supply Russia with the weapons Russia has asked for? It's decision time for President Putin. Based on the rally that we saw, it doesn't look like he's backing down for one moment. In fact, there are reports of increased fear in Russia, opponents having Zeds daubed on their apartment doors, and decision time for Joe Biden.
But also decision time in some senses for ordinary Russians, because these sanctions are going to really bite and affect everyone, aren't
they? Exactly. I think they're just beginning to bite now. You're just beginning to see supermarket shelves lacking the Western goods that Russians, certainly in the cities, have become used to. So I think it's beginning, yes. Now, whether the true... Remember, it's more than 2 weeks since we had a casualty figure from Russia about the number of dead, and then
they're still saying 400. Yeah.
So are the body bags coming home?
Yeah.
We actually don't know.
OK, Bill, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to Bill Neely and, of course, to all of our colleagues and guests on this special programme this morning. And that brings to an end our special ITV News programme this morning on the war in Ukraine. As the conflict now goes into its 4th week, there is little hope of it ending. Ranveer Singh will be here from 7 tomorrow morning with all the overnight developments. And you can keep across events as they happen on our social media channels and on our website, itv.com/news. We'll have the latest in our lunchtime update at 12:45. Until then, from all of us here and everyone aboard, thank you for joining us and have a great weekend.